Hi folks, this is Joe Wheaton, Utah State University, and I'm going to talk to you about how we read riverscapes to inform the planning process in low-tech process-based restoration. And specifically, uh, riverscapes being defined by their valley bottoms, and we've got a nice example here that folks are looking at up in the Kern wilderness, golden trout wilderness in the Sierras. How do we map that? How do we identify what's that area that could plausibly flood in the contemporary natural flow regime? So if we can, big part of reading riverscapes is recognizing where those valley bottom margins are. And then after that, we will get into some of the structurally forced processes. Uh, if you're looking for a substitute to taking an actual geomorphology class, I'd highly recommend the textbook by Kirsty Friars and Gary Brierly. It's pitched at a really understandable level, and it's a great sort of way in. Plus, the subtitle here is an approach to reading the landscape, and they focus on that skill set. So Jeremy showed us this phase one with low tech, and he said, well, this is all complicated, right? Basically the brown stuff and the white boxes, that is part of the conservation planning process. This is the sort of planning circle. And then we've added these complicating factors, these green boxes, which are questions, key questions you need to address, and the yellow diamonds, which are sort of decision points, okay? And so we're going to jump ahead right now to the inventory of resources. And this is one of the key questions. What part of the valley bottom is available? Well, to answer that question, you need to know what a valley bottom is and have that valley bottom mapped first. Okay, so recall principle one, streams need space. They need their valley bottoms. So what we're interested in is, of course, how much space a stream needs. It varies based off of the valley setting. This valley bottom setting changes between laterally confined, partly confined, and laterally unconfined systems where there's different degrees of adjustment and types of adjustment possible for these systems. So how do we map that? Remember this? Clear and Thorn, right? So remember, if we were talking about those areas where stage 0 or 8 were possible, those anastomosing conditions, then that's also kind of a question of how much of the valley bottom is available. It could be that stage 0 is possible if you map your valley bottom and you look at where it could access and where there's not conflicts, maybe it is the whole valley bottom. Or maybe it's something less, right? Maybe there's an inaccessible portion that we want to think about, okay? That maybe has incompatible land use, etc. So just because there's an accessible portion doesn't mean that we can't have some good things. Here's a nice real world example of this, where this system on the right was bought up as a part of a conservation, I'm sorry, on the left is bought up as a conservation easement. The valley bottom is mapped here in yellow. And it's already starting to move away from where it was put. The river was put over here. This thing was drained so it could be used for grazing, and it's no longer used for that. And it started eating back into this system, and so really the whole thing is potentially available. Okay. By contrast, over here, what we've got is a system big valley bottom. You can see relics of old sort of channel scars and hints of anastomosing. Currently, the part that could be available is just here in green, right? We've got constraints of homes, roads, railroad grades. And so despite all our rhetoric about, and Mark telling us about reimagining what's possible, it doesn't mean it's all or nothing. We can still reimagine a more functioning system, a stage 8 anastomosing system in this particular setting. We also care about this from a mesic habitat or a riparian habitat point of view. This is an older cartoon. It's nice. 2004 happens to be probably envisioning a stage one sort of scenario, but it breaks things into floodplain, channel, and terraces. Okay, so terraces are abandoned floodplains or former floodplains. The floodplain or the valley bottom, that's the maximum probable riparian extent. Okay, and so the riparian vegetation associations, with different surfaces, everything that's within the valley bottom, right, is potentially in play for riparian and or wetland vegetation associations. Uh, this is sort of interesting too. The riparian dimensions and connectivity out of the same publication here, they talk about longitudinal, vertical, and lateral. So when we're talking about that lateral extent, that's our valley bottom. The vertical cross section determines, water availability and how accessible some of these components are. And the longitudinal pattern controls the fluxes of water, sediment, and nutrients through this. And so when we have more structural forcing and more lateral and vertical connectivity, we actually have a less efficient conveyance of all mass through that system and more variable resonance time. So we should back up to something that probably seems pretty obvious. So what's a valley? Clearly, here's a valley. This is sort of a U-shaped valley, formerly glaciated. It would be V if it came down to a V, but it doesn't. It comes down to U. So these steep walls. This was all under ice. A valley versus a valley bottom. Okay. This is out of a paper that's kind of a boring encyclopedic sort of terminology paper, right, of basically the building blocks of mapping fluvial systems. And so we call it a fluvial taxonomy, and in it we talk about geomorphic units, we talk about structural elements, and we talk about some of these margins that you map. So with geomorphic units, some real coarse ones at tier 1 are, you identify a landform, you're on that landform, and are you in the channel or are you out of the channel? If you're in the channel, right, you'd be mapped as blue. If you're out of the channel, is it a surface that is inundated by mainstream floods? If it is, it's an active floodplain. If it isn't, it no longer historically might have been, maybe it's a terrace, or if it's only inundated by tributary floods, it's a fan, or we've got hill slope and uplands, right? So these different building blocks are important. If you recognize those, you can arrive at what is your valley bottom by recognizing the broad valley first and then taking away some of these other features. And it's really a question of whether or not they could plausibly flood. And so I just want to show you, this is an example from a paper Kirsty Friars and I wrote, and others on kind of differentiating different valley settings based off of A, mapping these valley bottoms, and then B, we'll talk about in a little bit of what mapping confining margins in there. So the really interesting thing when you do this sort of mapping is identifying where different margins overlap. And so what I mean by that is, it's one thing if you have a valley margin. So there's a valley margin here, and there's a valley margin here. This valley margin happens to be a valley margin and a valley bottom margin, whereas this one is just a valley margin. What's in between it and the valley bottom margin? This terrace, this higher surface. This was once upon a time in a bygone flow regime inundated, but is by the main stem, but the system is cut down and left that terrace high and dry. Versus a fan that's coming in from some sort of tributary. Okay, so these help us differentiate reach types, and they also set up the planform steering of flow within these different valley settings. So this is a figure from page 9 of your pocket guide, and we use this when we're out in the field to just kind of give us a little reminder of what are those geomorphic units, what are those building blocks, what are those margin types, okay? And so we're doing this because we're interested in where are there restoration opportunities. So if we look at this one, flow is from left to right. This is a hypothetical riverscape, okay? And how would I know that flow is from left to right? It's kind of a fun game to play. Well, you just look at this and, why isn't it from right to left? Well, there's two clues. The easy one are the beaver dams, and they're ponding water behind them. The little bit more subtle one, people will try and read like the shape of bars and the shape of the meander bends and stuff. That's fun, but fraught with peril. Not reliable. What is reliable are these things. Those are channel heads. These are head cuts marching up the floodplain. Um, what they're indicative of is a well-connected floodplain. They're not a bad thing. These head cuts are indicative of overbank flows coming across these floodplain surfaces, and then upon re-entry into the lower channel, they carve back and they rework the topography of that floodplain. They add confluences to the system and create some amazing little backwater habitats. So in a system like this, in an anastomosing system like this, there will be more confluences than there are diffluences where the channel splits. And that's because of this phenomenon. So I've taught two cross sections through this thing, one at A to A prime and one at B to B prime. And so you can see how this terrace surface, right, it's creating something that's not inundatable by this system anymore. But look at the head differential in cross section between these beaver dams on the floodplain surface and this channel over at this side. We see that sort of cross valley, real big difference in elevation head a lot in these structurally forced systems. What we also see here is where the fan, and so this is downstream, where that fan is basically pinching the valley. And so I stole the thunder here from this little game that you can play on predicting what is going on. Okay, so what I want you to do is print out this exercise. It's available in this PDF. It's also available separately on the web page where you're watching this video from. And I'm not actually going to have you map the valley bottom. I'm going to have you map some other features to get a feel for how important this valley bottom is. I'm giving you the valley bottom in green. What I'm also giving you as context here is a LiDAR hillshade. And the orange line is what comes off of the National Hydrographic data set, the NHD. It's also what you'd find on a USGS 7.5-minute quad. So this is in red where we are in this little drainage network. Happens to be the Asotin, where Steve took us earlier. And so make sure you have this handy. Get your Crayolas out. And I'm going to walk you through this, but you can pause as you need to and take as long as you need to do the drawings. So a little bit of context. This is the reach that we're in. So you can see that there's a road. This road is in black, South Fork Road along here. And we're in a fairly steep, walled, narrow little valley. This is actually a basalt canyon, and this is lush mantled plateaus up high, and this is cut deep down into these basalt canyons and gorges that drain down to the Snake. So we're going to look from river mile 1.5, river mile 2.2, flows from left to right, and your first job is to trace the actual channel. So I am going to stop speaking for about 5 seconds here. That's where you should pause and draw it. Get out a blue pen and do your best to trace what you think is the channel. So I'm hoping that took you a minute or 2. Maybe it took you 3 minutes. There's some wrong answers. There's multiple right answers. This is a pretty sloppy trace job by me in PowerPoint, okay? But it's good enough. What I'm getting out of this is the position of the channel on the valley bottom. This is really important. Okay, this is telling me whether or not I'm moving around and just accessing my floodplain in that valley bottom, or whether I'm abutting what we call confining margins. Okay. Next thing we're going to do is have you map the fans. And I'm going to start you off just to train your eye with this little fan here in the lower left. And so I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to stop talking for this video just for 5 seconds. But yeah, take 2-3 minutes and map the fans that you think you see. Okay, so let's go through and map the ones I found. I'm going to keep going on river right here. Got a little one there. Got a little bit bigger one there going across the road. Another one there going across the road. Okay. And then what's interested about these fans, if you think about these are a mix of alluvial and colluvial fans coming out of a mix of gullies and ephemeral little draws. And what do? They're puking out material from the source zones that are eroding these hill slopes, right? And they're providing sediment to the system. Sediment is one of the meals that rivers are adjusted to. What's the role of that road? Well, the role of the road is to disconnect that meal, cut it off. If I'm the county, public works guy maintaining this road, what I'm going to do if, a little thunderstorm parks up here and this thing pukes out a bunch of sediment, I'm going to get my backhoe and I'm going to clean it up. I'm going to get rid of it. And I'm probably not going to dump it in the river. I'm just going to get rid of it, right? And so this is something that is very pervasive in so many of our valley bottoms, where these, in this case, the position of the valley bottom margin here is not really changed, but the nature of that margin is very different. Now, here's a nice big fan puking out on river right, and notice that the channel has access to it, that it could feed itself from. Why would I care about that? Well, if I'm Steve Bennett, I care a bunch about steelhead in this system, and for spawning in this otherwise pretty armored system, we need nice, well-sorted gravels into riffles and bars, and these fans can provide that. So those are the 3 fans I have on river right, and those are well coupled river left fans. So the next thing I want you to do is to map the confining margins. For this, I'd suggest you get out like a pink or red highlighter. And what you're going to do is you're going to go and you're going to map the margin where the blue channel is abutting the valley bottom margin. This is one where it's both the valley margin and a valley bottom margin, so it's abutting hill slope. So I'm going to stop for 5 seconds. You can pause the video and you can take a few minutes to do that. Okay. Hopefully you guys picked up this one. Got a nice fan here. Another one there where it's up against the fan. Potentially a little bit of one there. Potentially a little bit of one here. Maybe a tiny bit there. Maybe it's rip-wrapped. Maybe it's not. Okay. But notice what we've done. This really simple exercise. You can go to any Riverscape and play this game, okay? Doesn't matter how different of a Riverscape it is. You can map out these features. Well, what we've just mapped, I'm going to come to this in a moment, is confinement in pink. and we've differentiating between confinement that's good, that might provide a meal to the river, versus confinement that's sort of cut off, versus confinement that could threaten an anthropogenic resource we may want to pay attention to or just keep an eye on. So this tells us a lot, okay? What it's telling us, and what Gary Brierly and Christy Fryers in the River Styles framework, that's telling us about the natural capacity for adjustment. You map different valley bottoms, you map channels, if there are any, in that valley bottom. You can have an intact valley fill or a discontinuous channel. But you map these things, and whether I'm dealing with an anastomosing system, a meandering system, a braided system, a gorge, what these arrows are describing are the degree of adjustment and the types of adjustment. Like, in a braided river where we might get an occasional avulsion. An avulsion is basically where you go from having a defluence to not. It's a channel switching event, right? You can also get lateral adjustment that may build new splits, defluences. You can have bank erosion in this, and you can adjust upwards, right? But this one can't cut down because it's got a bedrock base. You get a vertical adjustment in this gorge, but not much else, right? So these are really helpful for identifying what sort of flavor of system that you're in. If you recall, we talked about the third principle of Riverscape health. It depends. What does it depend on? Depends on the reach type. How do you get reach type? Well, your entry point is what you just did. So if you delineate these valley bottoms, it helps you address, what's in play for freedom space, what's the maximum extent of riparian vegetation you might expect, what's the, potential for flooding, okay? So here's just an example of variable valley bottom mapped on a small portion of a landscape up in Wyoming. You can do this just with your eyeball on Google Earth. You can do it in the field. We've built some tools that help you do this from topography. So we have a national elevation data set in the US that's 10 meters. We're going to have 2 to 3 meter LiDAR for the whole country soon. And in some places we have high resolution LiDAR. But what we've got everywhere right now is 10 meter DEM. And it does a remarkably decent job. Our first generation of VBET basically took an algorithm from the Fluvial Corridor Toolbox, which just said the logic was, give me an input of my topography and my drainage network and buffer that and look for flat areas. That's it. Look for low slope, the dark black areas. All we did was say we want to run this across entire drainage networks. So what's flat is kind of a function of drainage area. What's flat in a large, system is going to be a much lower slope threshold versus what's flat in a steeper system. It's going to be a little bit higher threshold. We can run the same thing. This is a 10 meter DEM you're seeing here, and the output in the 10 meters in red, versus this. This is a 1 meter LiDAR derived DEM, and its output is green here and is orange there. And yeah, there's some interesting little discrepancies where the 10 meter gets it sort of wrong, but it's not that bad, and it compares really well to what you can get off of quaternary geologic maps. It's also practical. You can run this. This is just a small example from running this over 25,000 kilometers in Utah. And you can zoom into any place. You can run this for perennial, as is shown here, and get a feel for what you're looking at. Thanks to the Bureau of Land Management, who actually originally paid for some of this development in Utah, but and now up in Montana and the Dakotas, they're investing in turning this from an operational grade tool into a commercial grade tool. We've already got a beta version of a production grade. What does all this stuff mean? Well, this means some amateur scripts that work if you know what you're doing for GIS. Whereas these things are fancier production grade tools that we run, and the same thing that you stream Netflix on. We run this in Amazon Web Services, and we can scale this up, and we're using the USGS's APIs to access that data, and we do all this computing in the cloud. And so what I'm showing you is an output of the valley bottom extraction tool run across the entire Columbia River Basin. I've zoomed in a little so you can see it. And we've also changed the algorithm so that we're not just relying on one line of evidence, basically slope. We're also relying on height above nearest drainage, a sort of detrended DEM, waterways, and you can put in other layers like wetland mapping, like FEMA flood maps, etc. And so what you get is actually a probability surface, and then you can threshold those. What's the probability of being a valley bottom cell? These are all ways to help you map the area that could plausibly flood. And this is going to turn into a commercial grade tool and web app that you can screen your sites and do this at fairly broad scales. Well, United States. If you want to learn more, there's some more boring videos from my ecohydraulics class where I go into some of these, and so there's links right here to that. I mentioned confinement. The NRCS is actually investing in, for the entire Mississippi Basin, being able to map confinement and then being able to delineate reach types from some of these same things. These same exercises that you can do by hand just using your brain, you can do at massive scales. The Mississippi Basin is a rather respectable size, I would argue. This is an example of where you can go with some of this stuff, right? So in light green and in these colored lines is the valley bottom and floodplain. And then the rest of the colors represent different types of landforms. So alluvial fans, coalesce fans, gluvial fans, talus slopes. And so this is just showing what kind of margins this is abutting against, so that you can get a handle on sediment sources. So when you start playing those games, you can combine those with some other attributes, and you can start breaking things out into reach type. So there's a whole bunch of stuff there, which you don't need to do all of those things to be a practitioner. I just want you to be aware that there are tools emerging, there are accepted methods for doing this, but this valley bottom mapping exercise, and we're going to reinforce that in another exercise a little later, is extremely valuable. Now, the thing that you are really getting gypped in doing this workshop virtually is my favorite part of these face-to-face workshops, is getting you guys out in the field and helping you read a Riverscape on your own. And this is not a great substitute, but if you go to this resource page on Reading Riverscapes, and I'll try and add some more of these over time, but for now, this is a place where I've taken, close to 500 people or more up on a little hike. And so there's an hour and 10-minute video that you can watch, which is basically me walking up this thing as if I'm walking with you, with a GoPro and with a drone, and just pointing out what we see, reading this riverscape, and then also talking about structural forcing, which we'll get into in a little bit. So I'd encourage you to watch that. You can fast forward through it if you get bored. There's also a 20-minute video, which is the walk back down on your own, where I don't talk at all. It's just my eyes, and it's just supposed to help you interpret what you think you see. So that's kind of fun as well. Okay, so this will help you experience a little of what you would have. Yeah, so I'd encourage you to check that out because this skill set of just reading a riverscape is pretty fundamental. Okay, that's all we got. Thank you.